Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this seventh in our series of US election discussions, and the one that I'm very pleased that our US Americas team labeled Early Reflections on the Presidential Election, because reflections is probably the right thing to be able to undertake on what has been, well, what is the morning over here in the UK after a very mobile, tempestuous, and still dramatic US presidential election and congressional set of elections that have been taking place in the United States Tuesday, now into Wednesday. Before I do various introductions, just to remind you all that this is a on-the-record meeting. It's being live streamed as well. We are going to have a conversation, or I'm going to moderate a conversation with our three speakers, panelists, guests with us here today. And then I'll move over after about 20, 25 minutes, maybe half an hour tops, to take questions from you and comments if you wish as well. But do please use the Q&A function. Do not use the chat. Do not use the raise hand. Get your questions into the Q&A. We'll keep a track of them. If I'm able to call one or two people to go live with their questions, we will. Otherwise, I will sift through the set of questions in the middle and really look forward to them, because I've been scratching my head trying to think of my own early reflections and how to manage this conversation. I think we'd always known and that this was going to be an unpredictable election, but nonetheless, it's turned out to be, I think it's fair to say, a lot narrower than others had predicted. And to be able to talk about what is going on, what just happened, and what may be happening looking forward over the coming weeks and ideally into 2021, let me say we're very pleased to have with us Megan Greene. Megan is the Dame DeAnne Julius Senior Academy Fellow with Chatham House on International Economics, and is also a Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'm sure many of you read her column in the Financial Times, and somebody who is a very astute analyst, commentator, and forward looker on the global economy and the US economy as well. And I think that dynamic will be especially interesting and maybe one that's been neglected a little bit in this conversation. So Megan, great you could be with us at the moment. And I have this horrible feeling it's very late at night or very early in the morning where you are. Not too early in the morning, getting a little bit better by now. But I don't know how much sleep you had. And the same would go for John Micklethwait. John, delighted you could join us. John has been since 2015, the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News, which covers all of Bloomberg's news outputs and platforms, and also Bloomberg Intelligence. He was, from 2006 to 2015, as you all know, editor-in-chief of The Economist. And he's been a regular author of books with his colleague Adrian Woolridge. And I obviously was going to mention today a very appropriate one for this conversation, the wake-up call, why the pandemic has exposed the weakness of the West and how we can fix it. The fixing bit is going to be all the more interesting after this particular US presidential election. And I'm sure some of those dynamics about the strength of the state and so on, John, will be something you can touch on. But I do want to remind our guest today that John was also the author way back in 2004 with Adrian Woolridge of the book, The Right Nation, Why America is Different, and trying to explain the takeover of the Republican Party by those on the more conservative right back in the days of George W. Bush. So John, we're going to be trawling through your mind on those issues and its insights for today. And then my colleague, last but very much not least, Leslie Vinjamuri, who is the director of our US Americas program, dean of our Queen Elizabeth Academy, author or co-author along with a number of our other colleagues of our latest report on US foreign policy priorities. I think it was well crafted, I remember Leslie, before the election, so that you gave yourself room, you and your colleagues, to be able to think about how America's foreign policy would change more broadly, not just dependent on one outcome or another of the election. And that will make your input to this conversation all the more valued. So thank you very much, all three, for joining us. I'm going to jump in the deep end. Leslie, you are, as a colleague of mine, I'm afraid you're going to have to take it first on the chin, as they say. I'm trying to think how to phrase this question. The best I could come up with is, what just happened? Because I know it's still happening, and so that's probably an unfair question. I'll let you unpack it. But the only stat I want to put out there right now, and I know there is counting going on, obviously, and these numbers will change and we don't know the result yet. But the one number that does strike me, and I'm sure many others, is the popular vote right now seems to be 50.2% for Joe Biden and 48.3% for Donald Trump. And that's pretty narrow compared to all of the polling. Even if you were to halve the main polling predictions from their 8% to 4%, to end up at 2% really takes us back into the territory of the 2016 election. So I'm just going to use that as my setup and throw the ball over to you, Leslie. Share a few opening thoughts and we're going to have a conversation. So we'll keep coming back to different parts of it. Over to you.
Okay, so the first thing is it's not over. It's really not over. We are really in the middle of this. The second thing is, election day is a misnomer. Election day is the day on which the polls close. The polls, as we know, have been open for a very long time. And we have seen a historic turnout. I think it's probably the most significant thing, apart from the result, about this election. This is the highest turnout that we've seen in the United States since 1900. 66.9% of those who are eligible to vote have voted. That's the data that we now have. That is extraordinary. The thing that's significant about that is that we have all sorts of assumptions about what that means, about who's voting. And the fact is we don't know. So there are the thing that probably I have found most upsetting and unsettling about the last certainly the last 8 hours, but far more than that, are the number of claims that people are making, having been schooled for weeks by those who've run the polls, not to make claims not only about results, but we don't yet know. We don't yet know the popular vote, even in states that we pretty much know the outcome. There are many, many ballots still being counted. In Pennsylvania, there are 1.4 million ballots still to be counted. So there are any number of things that we don't know in terms of demographics. We have all sorts of hypotheses. We have data that are pushing at confirming some of those. But we need to be deeply empirical about evaluating this election because it's extraordinarily significant, not only because it's taking place in a pandemic, not only because America's changing demographically, not only because Donald Trump is one of a kind, but because we've been warned, right? And we know the scenarios. The second thing I would say is at some level, we're exactly where we've been warned that we would be, which is that, a lot of people thought, wow, Texas is changing. Look at the demography. They're getting out the vote. Maybe it will flip. But, that was a bit of a long shot. And in any number of states, even though in a lot of battleground states, the polls predicted that Vice President Biden had the lead, it was never a sure thing. And there were so many scenarios, remember the Bart Gellman scenario that said it's going to come down to the upper Midwest 3 states, maybe Arizona, which has become very interesting. NE2, my home state, Arizona, AP says it's flipped. And NE2, it's flipped. So those are 2 very interesting things. But really, a lot of people thought it would come down to these 3 upper Midwest states, and it has. And then the other thing that we were told was it's going to take time. And on election night, we're going to see a red mirage. It's going to look like it's going Republican. And then over time, as the mail-in ballots come in, it's going to take time. They're going to look blue. And guess what? We knew that. We've been told it. And everybody, myself included, saw it in the middle of the night. And for those of us who want one result, we panicked, even though we knew that this is where we were heading. So it is very interesting. The part of this is exacerbated by the fact that the New York Times, CNN, AP, Fox are calling things at very, very different points in time. Arizona was called by Fox very early. The president was very upset. AP called it much later. The New York Times and CNN, I don't think, have called it. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and people are making they're using a different metric for when to draw that line. In terms of where we're going, it now looks like, and again, it looks like, but we do not know. It looks like in Wisconsin and Michigan, things are beginning to turn more blue as more of those mail-in ballots come in. Nevada, they've said there are going to be no updates until tomorrow. They're just holding on that. Pennsylvania is going to take quite some time. And I think Arizona is likely to be confirmed. So what does that mean? A lot of people think that even though it's a much shorter margin than perhaps a lot of people had hoped for or thought there might be, people seem to think that, on a knife edge, it's heading towards an electoral victory for Vice President Biden. But what we know is it is an unusual election, and it is very, very far from over.
Well, thank you, Leslie, and for just keeping our feet or putting our feet back on the ground for those people who have been staying up late at night or who have been glued to their phones or screens this morning, try to make head or tail of it. I think the way you put it there, and a lot of the reports have indicated that certainly the Biden campaign had always felt that Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania axis was going to be critical, whatever happened. As you said, in a way, there haven't been that many surprises in where the states have been going so far, although the margin appears a little closer. And just one point, I think, very important, you were just saying there about people over-interpreting data. I was certainly hearing a lot of commentary about exit polls yesterday evening. And as somebody noted, it's rather hard when you do exit polls, and yet in a lot of states, the votes have been at least 50%. Either done early or mailed in, and therefore there's been no exit on that particular group of people. So this is a very difficult, as you said, election to read, as it's not a day, not even a week, it's been more than a month. I'm going to come over to you now, John, because I think I'm just wondering what your takeaways are right now on my opening kind of easy question, what just happened. Have you taken away any particular lessons just from this febrile night and the way that the cookie seems to be crumbling this morning, something that you did not think before you went into it last night? What are you taking away from the moment? I've got a couple of follow-ups I can do on it, in particular, the kind of shy Trump vote, if you see what I'm saying. But I'm just wondering, what would you share with our guests today and our audience about what you're taking away as being different?
Well, I think I agree with a lot of what Leslie's just said. For what it's worth, on the Biden side, about just whilst we've been on air, so to speak, in Michigan, it's just flipped to Biden being in the lead as the mail-in votes come. So at the moment, you would say, with all the usual massive caveats, that it mildly favours him. If there is no clear result, I think it's worth remembering, having sat in my previous job, I think up for 5 consecutive, or maybe it was more than that, 6 or 7 consecutive Wednesdays at The Economist waiting for things to go through, or Thursday night. It takes quite a while for these things to reach the Supreme Court, let alone beyond. But at the moment, if Michigan and Pennsylvania, the mail-in things are coming Biden's way, it would give him quite a strong position. I think the second point is really easy, is that the polls were not good. In some ways, they seem to be worse than they were. I'd have to check the exact numbers. They seem to be worse than they were last time, because this time they can't claim quite such as much of a surprise about where Trump voters are. But on this, I think last time they weren't that inaccurate. They were sort of saying a Hillary win of 3 to 4%, and she won the popular vote at any rate by 2.3%. It looks like this time the lead might be narrower. So everything about it is probably wrong from that thing. So there will be inquests in there. I think it does show. I'll make 2 sort of bookish points. Obviously entirely egotistical. The one is I think it does show the kind of underlying strength, which, to be honest, even I'm slightly surprised by, of the kind of conservative America. There is still a bedrock of people who are very, very supportive of conservative policies in America, and it's worth considering how much what would have happened without COVID. It now seems, I think, much more likely that Trump probably would have won without that. The other point, going the opposite direction in terms of sort of waking up the West, I think that the thing which must be wrong, and this is where I disagree with Leslie a bit, is I think it looks terrible. This thing about it's wonderful that 66% of the people voted. Well, really, is that such a large amount? It's great by American standards, but it's lousy by anybody else's. And what on earth are we doing waiting all this time for things to happen and for the machinery to be out of date? And I think it underlines just how bad the public sector is, how the American state does need to be reformed. And that's obviously what we're now writing about. But I think all those things sort of slightly come together at the moment. But in terms of being able to forecast it, nobody would put all their money on one horse.
Yeah, and just on that business about the this election exposing once again some of the insufficiencies of American public administration, or at least seeming to do, running an election as complex as this. Does it disguise, in a way, a discipline, in your opinion, on the right? However this election pans out in the end, it is fair to say, I think, that the Democratic Party community, or Democratic supporters, are a very diverse set of communities and individuals and viewpoints, and in some cases quite divided, as we saw in the primary election. And there was a lot of questions for those of you in the UK from Andrew Neil, a more rather combative interviewer on British television, asking one of the Democratic pollsters and commentators last night, why can't you guys get it together? You've got the majority on everything. It's growing minorities, there's more young people, there's 13 million more college educated people right now. He kept hammering them on this. And I'm just wondering, John, do you feel there's something about the way the right coalesces, and maybe Democrats can be more divided in their outlooks? Is there some big story here, or some big truth here? What do you think?
I think the right is a more cohesive unit. I think that generally is true. And when I say that, I do not mean it is a cohesive unit, because there are massive divisions within it. But I think the divisions on the Democratic side tend to be slightly larger. I think one of the great mysteries is how come that with big tech having so massively supported Democrats, and with certainly Obama being the first person to really use Facebook and all these things, how come in a weird, strange way, it's the populist right who keep on being able to use this? Because if you look at the way that Trump has run COVID, which by any measure has not been a great success, the fact that he's still here fighting in with a chance is an amazing tribute to that bit, and it's partly due to the America is just simply a more conservative fact. It's not how many people in Europe want to look at it. We've always argued that. But the second point is that it's also to do with the fact that the right seem to be better at campaigning in some things, right, both in the high arts, the tech bits, and possibly in the low arts as well.
Like the note of the low arts, and we've got a lot of questions coming in already, some of which I don't think need to be unmuted and asked, and I'm just going to ping one really nasty one over to you, John, but though actually you probably won't mind, given where we are right now. But Andres Rosenthal, who I presume is in Mexico City, asked a quick question. Why was The Economist so far off? And of course, you can, with loyalty even to your last publication,
you should address that to the Economist. It's a very good magazine, is what I would say, and it's much better edited than it used to be.
Maybe I'll ask you later how Bloomberg was calling it on your thing, but I'll let you prepare your answer to that one. Megan, let me come to you, because I think there's another dynamic here, and again, I most definitely do not want to overinterpret things I was hearing last night, especially when there were some of these from exit polls, but there's got to be some element of truth to it, even if it's skewed. But the issue that seemed to be most of the top of the mind of those who turned up on the day to vote, which we know is half maybe of the total voters. I don't know the precise proportion, but it is not, it is not overwhelming, let's say majority, but is that they put the economy at the top of their worries, and issues such as the coronavirus, even race relations came lower down. And I'm just wondering whether you feel there's a dynamic here that maybe is not as appreciated in London or in UK or around Europe or other parts of the world, the extent to which, how has America's economy been doing pre-COVID, and whether you think there are many Americans who kind of trust Trump or a Trump administration to manage the recovery from the COVID crisis better. What's your sense? Do you think the economy has been a player in the way this election appears to be a little tighter than people thought?
Yeah, so I think that's a fair point. According to a recent Pew Research poll, when voters were asked what issues were crucial in helping them determine their voter choice, 79% said the economy, and that was the biggest issue. Healthcare was number 2. Coronavirus made it 4th on the list, which was a surprise to me. But the old adage, it's the economy, stupid, I think certainly was part of, has been part of the results here. Now, when people were polled on who was doing, who they had more confidence in managing the economy, actually Trump was a little bit ahead of Biden there. But what was the economy looking like going into this election? I'd say it was a tragedy in 3 acts, pretty much, our experience through this crisis. First, we had this precipitous decline as we all shut down from March to mid-June. Then we had this incredible bounce back. We just got the third quarter GDP figures. The US grew by over 30% annualized, best growth ever, certainly, but from the worst bottom ever. And then the third act is one we entered, I'd say about a month and a half ago, which is the long, hard slog. And there, if you looked at all the high frequency data, it was going sideways. So the labor market has really recovered, but it's still very much recovering, and it's harder to get the last 20% of workers back in jobs than to get the first 20% back in jobs. So we shouldn't be surprised the number of long-term unemployed is set to triple in the next 2 months. So it will be even harder to get them back in jobs, and when they do, they'll have lower wages, according to most research. Consumer spending was going sideways, the mobility data was going sideways. So our recovery is very much petering out, and that's no surprise given that most of the support that Congress put together for workers and small businesses expired at the end of July and early August. So the US has been just running on fumes, and the fumes have been the savings that businesses and people have put away, and they've just been running them down, which is not at all sustainable. So in terms of management of that going forward, Joe Biden's platform put forward a plan to spend $7 trillion over the next 10 years. The 2 biggest envelopes were healthcare, that was the biggest package, and then secondly was infrastructure and climate change. So there was a plan to launch a massive green infrastructure project that would create a whole bunch of high-wage, high-hour jobs for workers. So it would address sustainability and also upgrade the US workforce pretty significantly. How are we going to pay for this? The plan was to hike taxes on corporates and wealthy individuals. That was Biden's platform, but keep tax cuts for the middle class. That was going to cover $4 trillion. The other 3, we just borrow it. Borrowing costs are, in real terms negative actually. So the government gets paid to borrow at the moment. So that's sort of a no-brainer. Trump's platform is a little bit less well fleshed out. I've done a lot of presentations on Trumponomics versus Bidenomics, and I've had to go through a lot of Trump speeches to figure out what his policies are. For the most part, it's just kind of more of the same. That's generally what we can expect on the tax front. We know that there will be tax cuts if Trump is reelected. We just don't know for who or which taxes or by how much. The capital gains tax, he wants to cut to 15%. So that's a detail we do know. But aside from that, we don't have that many details. We just know he stands for lower taxes. I think we could expect deregulation to be a priority for Trump. So his plan for the labor market is to create jobs by deregulating and cutting taxes, and then hopefully companies will have more profits that they can then plow into hiring people. Why they would do that instead of just engaging in stock buybacks and dividends, that's unclear. But that's sort of been his labor market agenda all along. In terms of trade, I think we could expect Tariff Man to stand. For the UK, actually, there's a big difference between candidates in that Trump stands for bilateral trade agreements. Biden has a much more multilateral approach, and given the EU is considered our ally, I think it would be more difficult for the UK to secure a bilateral trade deal with the US under a Biden presidency than a Trump one. There isn't that much water between the 2 candidates, though, on trade policy, and this always surprises international audiences, I find. Ultimately, the difference between the Make America Great strategy and the Buy American strategy aren't that huge. So I think we can expect industrial policy absolutely to reign under either candidate. So much more spending, I think, under Biden, less spending under Trump, but kind of a continuation of what we've seen.
Thank you very much for that little take. It also provides, I think, some useful segues here to a couple of questions. I think I might as well start pulling them in right now, because I think this question about how the US is going to be able to move forward with what appear to be quite different positions here. I'm wondering, Leslie, coming back to you for a second, when you look at the result of this vote, as John was noting, not necessarily a particular high turnout by global standards in democracies, but certainly very, very high for the US, and there's all sorts of dynamics to that. But do you sense here, therefore, a country that is as deeply divided as it was, and therefore one in which whoever takes the position up in the White House is going to struggle to be able to be an effective leader and carry the country forward? Not least as we're going to end up, I presume, at the very least with a, if Trump were to win, you would still have a Democratic House. And if Biden were to win, who knows, the Senate might still be Republican. You really got this prospect of continued gridlock. How worried are you that this election, in a way, is just going to fan the conviction of both sides? Both sides goes, this was mine to win and I lost it. Is each side going to be more convinced than it was before? Are you worried about an even more polarized America, and more gridlocked?
Yes, of course, America is deeply divided. We know this on multiple lines: generational, gender, suburban, urban, rural. It's partisan. Social values line up on either side of the aisle, along with economic values and all the rest of it, which is, that is polarization. So clearly, this is an issue. One thing that I have been wondering about, if it's true what we are starting to see, which is Wisconsin and Michigan beginning to look more blue, Arizona staying there, Omaha having given, believe it or not, an electoral college vote to Vice President Biden that might matter a lot. And we have a President Biden, by the end of the week, at least announced. What does that do to the Republican Party, right? Does it give the Republican Party in the Senate, who, looks like it may well continue to hold the Senate, does it give the Republican Party some breathing space to actually think about being part of a bipartisan moment? Biden has got a deep history of caring about working across the aisle. He's not, he clearly has to speak to the progressive wing of his party. At the same time, he himself represents a certain kind of America. I mean, he is heart and soul of middle America in many, many ways, even though many of his policies are much more progressive. But it's not clear to me that the Republican Party has loved having to bow to President Trump. I think there's a silent majority of Republicans that would have liked to have more flexibility. And maybe if we end up with a Democratic president who's moderate in many ways, maybe this gives the Republican Party the moment to think differently about their position. So I think we might see a lot of things change, and not least because, the pandemic moment, whoever is the next president is also going to be the person who leads the country through a virus, the therapeutics, getting back to work, new jobs, new economic stimulus. There are going to be so many good things. I know it's very hard to imagine at the moment, but there are going to be so many good things. So whoever is in charge has the capacity. And I agree with you, John, it looks awful right now. It looks awful. Trust me, I think you can hold those two truths simultaneously: an extraordinary turnout with young voters on the street, and my God, it looks awful. I think they're both true. But there are going to be a lot of opportunities to move America, not easy, but to move it in a different direction. And I think if we have Biden at the helm, I think we will see that begin to happen.
John, just coming back to you quickly, and again, there's a lot of questions. I'm not always calling everyone by name on this, but there are some questions there about whether there is a part of America that will potentially reject this outcome if it is one in which, to use the metaphor that Leslie was putting in before, that the red mirage then gets overtaken by the blue tide. And maybe I added the blue tide part in, but you know what I'm saying, where there's this sense that we had it and then it was taken away from us. Are you worried, or do you believe this could end up firing up that conviction of separateness, that unwillingness to compromise, and it might be even taken up by Mitch McConnell, who's back, in the Senate, and if they have the leadership of the Senate, could they afford to take that breathing time, in your opinion, that Leslie's been describing, to rethink what conservatism is about, what the Republican side is about, or do you think it just doubles down?
It's very difficult. It's very interesting. I think I think several things. I think firstly, I do agree with Leslie that actually in a strange way for Biden, a small victory might give him a sort of easier governing thing than a total blue sweep. He is from the centrist part of the Democratic Party. He's got a better record than many in terms of reaching out to people from the other side of the aisle. He's a kind of clubbable person, Joe Biden. You spend any time with him, he's liked, and that's one big reason why he's generally done better than Hillary. But on the Conservative side, it's quite interesting. You could argue, in the short term, I think you're right. I think McConnell, he's a clever, he's a clever kind of negotiator, tactician. He will try to play this a bit. He's not very helpful when Obama was around. They can block and tackle quite a lot. Just to give one last thing on Biden, and I'll give the rest on the Conservatives, is if you remember George W. Bush, the last person to win under very, very narrow circumstances, and he was supposedly a moderate, and then he went fairly gung-ho and took the attitude that a win is as good as a win and you get on with it. But one last thing on the Conservative side, I think in a strange way, and written about this, some elements of the Conservative Party of America do need to be rethought. And that's, I'm trying to look at it as much as possible from their point of view. I think there is an element whereby they've got to work out exactly what they think should do in terms of running the country, the public sector particularly. I don't think there is a conservative theory really about government beyond the fact they don't like it. And that in the end that didn't work with COVID. It's unlikely to work with other things. And sometimes you need a sort of time to refresh. And actually, from the Conservative side, you could argue that if they were going to lose, it'd be better to have something which really made them go away and think. Because in general, I think in both America and Britain, you go back to 1980, and since that time, we can still say this because Biden isn't in yet, there have only been 4 people who've not been conservatives who've occupied either the White House or Downing Street. And Obama and Clinton got in America. Clinton got in by pretending to be a conservative, you might argue. And over here, you had Blair, who certainly pretended quite hard to be a conservative, and Gordon Brown, who didn't actually get elected. So you've had this sort of conservatism has been the great. It's had most of the ideas. Many of the people on this call might not like that, but that's most of the ideas that have dominated the area in which most of us have lived have come from that side of the aisle. At this precise moment, it seems to be a little bit more short of ideas, and sometimes having a sort of a real period of opposition would sharpen it up again. So no doubt they'll be very pleased if they hang on the Senate, but I think there will be a point at which it could be useful to have a little bit of a rethink.
Yeah, very interesting point. I want to just come a little bit of the international side now. We've got a lot of questions about what's going to happen next, and so questions about Supreme Court and the count and stuff like that. So I'm just warning you that and these are being liked up the list of questions, so I'm not going to ignore them. But I'll let you be as armed as you can when we get these questions about the Supreme Court and Electoral College and that sort of stuff. But let me just go to a big question that Mark McKinnon of the Globe and Mail was asking, and I'll bring you in on this one, Megan. The world has changed massively since 2000, when we had the hanging chads and the insufficiencies of America's political system was revealed to the world. Can others take advantage of this moment? And maybe you could say a word or two about take advantage of it simply by leaving America stewing and getting on with recovery. And you can imagine the country I'm thinking about when I'm asking this question. What do you see this as a very different moment and therefore a vulnerability for America within that broader geoeconomic, geopolitical space? What are your thoughts on that, Megan?
Yeah, thanks. So I do know what you're talking about, China, and it's no coincidence, I don't think, that China came out with a huge announcement about Ant's IPO and also strengthened their trade restrictions with Australia to show some more muscle. I don't think it's coincidental that happened this morning as the US looks to be completely divided and dithering. I do think that there is an opportunity for other countries to be moving ahead while the US necessarily has to do some soul searching. I think one lesson, whoever wins this election, one lesson that we are learning is that Trumpism is here to stay. And so if Biden wins the election, then I think the Republicans have big decisions about, what the future of their party is. And I love Leslie's optimistic view on this, but I'm much more worried that actually the lesson is Trumpism is here to stay. And so what we get is a much more rightward lurching of the party. So you get even more extremism with a Tom Cotton or a Mark Rubio or Ted Cruz coming in to lead the party. And they're very different beasts from President Trump, but they're very right-wing and more extremist and much more clever about and subtle about how they go about it as well. So I think that's a big question that needs to be answered. And if Trump wins, then Trumpism is here to stay for 4 years in a blatant way. I do think that there is an opportunity for other countries to just go ahead to put the virus first, to recognize that the virus will determine the shape and pace of all of our economic recoveries, to prioritize that while the US is, still potentially figuring out who won how many votes in 3 states to determine the outcome of this election. So I do think this is a real weakness for the US, although I will say this election is so different from every other because of mail-in voting and early voting. It's really hard to make comparisons with 2016 even. You certainly can't compare it with 2000. I do think that mail-in voting and early voting are here to stay. So I think that the process of elections has been forever changed in the US, but we all knew it would take days potentially to count some of these votes. And we all knew that some of these results might be contested, and I think that we can expect that.
Just one quick follow-up economic question for you, Megan, if I can as well. Do you think it matters who's in the White House for the United States to be able to do a rapid recovery from the trough of COVID? In other words, do you need a president who says, right, I get what this is and I'm going to organize around it, or is it simply a case that you have to, whatever you try to do from the center, in the end, it's going to be America's internal economic dynamism that drags it out of this crisis, irrespective of who's in the White House? So do you think it really matters who wins to whether America is able to get itself back on the right track?
I think it really matters, actually. And it matters not only who wins the presidency, but who wins the Senate as well, because the fate and the size of the fiscal stimulus will be determined by that. And I don't really think of it as fiscal stimulus so much at this point as in catastrophe mitigation. Don't think of it as, extra stimulus to goose the economy. It's filling in the hole still very much. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the stimulus that was passed by Congress earlier this year has expired already. So there's still a really big hole that needs to be filled pretty quickly. And so, having politics even more divided off the back of this election than before it, that's not a great sign. As I mentioned, Biden had stood for a massive stimulus package, not just aiming to fill in the immediate hole, but with some longer term goals like sustainability embedded as well. Trump's spending plans are much more woolly. We don't really know. We'll get some kind of fiscal stimulus, certainly, off the back of these elections because we need it. But the composition and the size, I think, very much depends on who wins both the White House and the Senate.
I'm going to jump in with a couple of, just because I know what will happen. We'll run out of time at the end with some specific questions that there are so many about now. I keep being Chatham House-like and trying to turn it into the big questions, but let's go a little bit into very important weeds, not least as we've got one of our participants, one of our guest members on here, Lucy Blythe, who is actually writing to us. Well, I don't know, she's an absentee voter in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, very concerned about her vote being counted. And I'm wondering, Leslie, if you have any thoughts about how the integrity of this final part of the count, will it be protected? Can it be protected? Are you seeing things that make you feel reasonably confident that they're being protected or not?
It's exactly the right question. And by the way, I really respect the desire to stay right here in the middle of the now, because it's hard to describe, and we all know it. It is a moment that there's no reason to pretend that we're not where we are. I don't have any private knowledge. I think what we've all seen, the speech that President Trump gave this morning was deeply disturbing. And quite frankly, I think he was thinking on the spot. He was choosing his words as he was uttering them, about, it's fraud. We would have won. Actually, we have won. I'm going to go to the Supreme Court. He doesn't know what he's going to do, but he's certainly going to be thinking. His thinking will have developed a lot since that conference. We have every reason to believe that people on the ground have been prepared for the eventuality in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, and elsewhere to continue. And remember, Georgia is still in play unless something's happened in the last 50 minutes, and could be very important actually. Have every interest and every reason to believe that they will continue to count until those votes are counted, not only to determine the result, but because it's going to be absolutely critical to us being able to understand what happened in this election and to analyze those results. Remember when we had the midterm elections, we saw a similar thing. Things changed over time. But we don't know, right? We don't know what the president's going to do, and we don't know how successful he will be. And I'd hate to try and guess, but my guess is, if this drags on and isn't resolved soon, I would be pleasantly surprised if the president decides to lay low and accept the process and let it play out.
Thanks very much for that. Let me turn a question, John, to you. And again, if others want to comment on it, Megan or Leslie, just wave your hand at me and let me know if you want to come in on one of these questions as well. But question from Licia Scoli. Her camera's not working properly and she wanted me to ask the question. But she wanted to highlight the incredible influence of Fox News, how much over time it's created a rabbit hole into which moderate conservatives disappear, and people end up sort of debating their own propaganda. So, are we worried that this could be a lesson for Europe, especially in the UK, the potential rise of GB News? This idea of correcting the left-wing bias doesn't necessarily make for better debate, but for silos. And I think it picks up the point that was also asked by Tricia de Bourgrave just underneath this on the kind of prevalence of fake news that continues to circulate and is impossible to evict from the debate. What's your sense, John, about these dynamics inside the radicalization or polarization of American politics? Can it be fixed?
Well, several things. Firstly, in defense of Fox News, it's always, they were the people who called Arizona, much to the annoyance of the president. Secondly, they, a long time ago, they were probably the people who were toughest on Trump when he was the presidential candidate. And I do think it's, there is an occasional thing. There's a very good quote by Charles Krauthammer, one of the original neocons, where he was talking about Rupert Murdoch's deep genius, possibly not appreciated by your questioner, that he managed to somehow spot this tiny, tiny niche in America, which was about 40% of the population, which strangely didn't like PBS, NBC, CBS, and so on. And so I think there was, yes, there are bits of Fox which are a little bit extraordinary, but it does, they are catering at the core to quite a big part of America. And I think the bad news is that there are people who are far more extreme than that, wandering around. In terms of, is it coming to Europe? I think not, because I don't think there is a body of people for that. And, especially in Britain, I think you have a body of people around Brexit, but I don't see a single thing that would unite people in a similar way.
Okay, well, that's maybe reassuring. I wanted to find out whether a couple of questions about Electoral College and things like that. Can we unmute Mike Gapes? Because I think a question by Mike Gapes about the Electoral College, and also Rosella Cottam has also asked the question about how this election will shape the future of American democracy and electoral processes. Rosella would prefer not to come on mic, onto the microphone. Mike, is Mike there? Otherwise, I'll just ask.
Yes,
Mike. Go ahead, please. Ask the question. Introduce yourself and over to our panel.
Thank you. There's been talk of changing the Electoral College to make it more representative. Is that now dead as a result of the votes for the Senate, or is that still a prospect for a Biden presidency?
Who's going to take that easy question? Leslie's volunteered. I can see. Oh, Megan, you come in. Megan, go first, please. Great.
I was just going to say, the Electoral College system clearly pretty broken and antiquated. If we keep getting someone who wins the popular vote who doesn't win the election, you've got to ask questions about whether the Electoral College should be revised or not. It should. The problem is that whoever wins has won that game, and so they're less likely to go ahead. It's like turkeys voting for Christmas. They're less likely to go ahead and change that game because that's how they got to where they got. So I'm not hopeful for Electoral College reform.
Anyone else more hopeful, Leslie?
I would just say one thing. Clearly there's a need for reform. It's very unlikely to happen anytime soon. The agenda, even the domestic agenda, is going to be very, very long. And choose the things where you can move the needle and make a big difference. Electoral reform isn't going to be making that cut. But the other thing I would say is, I don't think we should go from one extreme to the other, right? Having grown up in one of those so-called flyover states, there is a legitimate argument to be made for preserving the right of people in large territories with fewer people to have some proportionate, which isn't proportionate control over decisions that are made that affect them, that isn't solely decided by population. They don't want to be ruled by New York and California, and that's very legitimate, but we've gone to the other extreme. And if we try to go back and deny that basic feeling, then it will never go anywhere. So it has to be a very serious process that takes both arguments very seriously into account.
And there's a question from Simon Burkett here about likely outcomes for the Senate and the House. Who on our wonderful panel feels they want to take that one on? Wave your hand if you're John, are you following that? Megan, Leslie, the House and the Senate. John, over to you first.
I can tell you what it looks like at the moment. It looks like the Republicans will just, the worst case is it might be equal Senate, but it looks like they'll probably hang on to it, and it looks like the Democrats have definitely, very likely won the House. Could even have a thing in Michigan where the Democrat, where Biden wins, where he's just stretched his lead in the presidential side, but they don't win the Senate seat there. So it's all up in the air, but that's the best, with all the usual caveats. I'm giving Leslie and Megan a chance to hide behind me on this. With all the massive caveats that we don't really know, and it's a long way to go, but that's the best guess at the moment.
Either of you want to come in on that? No, but anything to add, Leslie?
No, just that the obvious ones seem to have come through, if I'm not wrong. I think Doug Jones, is out, and Colorado's moved to Democrat, and I've now forgotten the other one that was the very obvious one. But some of the states that we thought might, shift on Senate, North Carolina, I think Susan Collins got reelected. Am I right there? I saw a tweet saying she was dancing in the streets. I think that means she must have been reelected.
So happy to be out of Congress. Of course, that's the other possibility.
If you buy into the argument that a landslide isn't going to do anything to deal with the issue of discontented, empowered people with very strong feelings about Donald Trump, then it's not necessarily a bad thing not to have a landslide that just completely disempowers and disenfranchises part of the population. It might be the best possible outcome, even if it's very painful for questions of governance in the short term.
I'm going to ask. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just really quickly, in terms of the markets, this is a weird election because usually the markets love gridlock because it means nothing can get done. And so they have much more certainty about their operating environment. This time around, as the blue waves seem to be more likely based on the polls, actually the markets rallied. So I think this time around, the markets have been cheerleading a blue wave because it meant certain stimulus. Now, if we get gridlock, that stimulus is not nearly so certain. And so I think the market reaction, I think we could see the market swoon off the back of that if there is gridlock this time, which is the exact opposite of what we usually see. Yeah.
I think from a foreign policy standpoint as well, what happens in the US Senate is going to be incredibly important for the kind of room for maneuver that whoever's the president has, and that, the Senate seems to me to have undertaken at times its own foreign policy, certainly on some of the issues like sanctions, which have not always been attuned with president's own views. So it'd be very interesting if we were to end up with a Biden presidency, but you still have Republican control of the Senate. I don't think it'll just be on domestic politics. This would have an impact, but potentially on the scope for foreign policy focus as well. Frini Chancy, Frini, are you able to unmute and ask your question? Because it actually ties into Dina Mufti's, which is top of the list. as Dina's questions always seem to be, generally first and top of the list. So Frini, come on in first. If you can unmute, otherwise I will ask your question for you. Are you there?
Yes, I'm right here, Robin. Thank you so much.
Please
So
go ahead.
thank you. So my question is, because there was an article on The Guardian and The Economist, so a few, prestigious newspapers were saying how Trump would challenge the outcome of the election, and especially regarding the votes that came in by post, which, as Leslie, I think, mentioned, it's the regular way of doing voting these days, and it looks like it's going to be the norm. So my question is, how does the US going to safeguard its democratic institutions against Trump's attempt to undermine them? Thank you so much for giving me the time to ask a question.
Pleasure, freely. And let me just say, I wanted to hook that, Leslie, Megan, John, to Dina Mufti's question, which is a very straightforward one. What role will the Supreme Court play in the outcome of this election? You could say too early to say, but that's Dina's question. So maybe you could combine those two in. I imagine they fit well together. Leslie, you unmute.
Did I lose you? This is, we're living through this winter, this moment. I don't have an answer. What we've heard is the states will have to look at this very carefully. If Donald Trump tries to contest it and go to a recount, then there are decisions made at the state level. He could take it to the Supreme Court, and we don't know what would happen. I still imagine and believe that people will try to stick to the process as much as possible. If you watch the press conference today, when the president spoke, what was the most interesting part about it was that the vice president did not mirror the words of the president. He very clearly did not claim that there was a result. He indicated that that it was still in process. That is a very interesting move. Not everybody wants to do what Donald Trump has done. When Donald Trump accepted the nomination on the lawn of the White House with all the people, and Ivanka stood up and gave a speech, whatever we think or whatever anybody thinks of Ivanka, good or lover or not lover, she did say, not everybody likes the way that my dad talks, right? People know this, and not everybody wants to follow the hard Trump line. Even, we tend to caricature those people who support Donald Trump. And I can tell you, and we can probably on this call, 150 people, I'm sure a lot of us have decent relationships with the number of people who, the media would put into this strange box of Trumpistas. And they're not all, they're not all crazy. There are a lot of normal, really normal, solid people who have chosen to ignore certain things because there are other things that are important to them. It's not like everybody wants to suppress democracy in America. So, it's going to be fought out. The other thing I wanted to just kind of slip in is that my concern about, we keep talking about the disenfranchised Trump voter if Biden wins. My concern on the Democratic side is the disenfranchised young voters who have turned out, who care so much and so passionately about democracy in America today because of Donald Trump and because of climate. And if Donald Trump comes out of this and wins, and America is now out of climate, we are going to see young people, so not all of them, but a very large number of young people who are out of school, in and out of school, out of employment, deeply care about the climate, passionate, lining up to vote, taking their ballots in, and seeing that they've lost. And I'm very, very worried about what that means for America.
Thanks, Megan. Come on in, and then I'm going to maybe a last question, because I know John has to go bang on the hour. Maybe we all do, but there's a very good question, which I'm going to get Dominique to ask after Megan's come in, which I think is right up your street, John. Megan, over to you first.
Sure, I was just going to say there's some precedent. So in Texas, there was a case that was launched to throw out a whole bunch of drive-through votes. And the Republican judge actually dismissed the case, saying that he didn't think that it was valid. So, it's a sample size of one. We can't necessarily extrapolate, but I think this will come down to state level recounts rather than being kicked up to the Supreme Court. And hopefully we just have to trust that judges will do the right thing.
Yeah, that seems to be the case in Pennsylvania as well. Dominique Kahatu, if I pronounce your name right, but I'll let you do that. But it's a question I think that goes to John's book, practically. So go ahead and ask your question. If you can unmute Dominique Kahatu. Otherwise, I will ask your question for you. Is there Dominique? I'm not hearing Dominique. I'm going to ask his question. Okay, Dominique, I'm asking you a question. Here we go. The West has struggled over the past 15 years or so years with legitimacy, COVID, et cetera, and now we've had another shock election, deep divisions. You know, how do we now make a case for the Western system in the face of Russia, China? But in any case, the Western system, the future of, how do we fix it or make the case for it, John?
Dominic is obviously an alias I use many times, but thank you. I had no idea that. Yes, the answer is please go and buy the Wake Up Call instantly, which is the book we've written about this. But yes, I think that is one of the great things. I think if you look at this year, when historians, Robin Niblett's The Future, come and look at 2020, despite everything we're saying at the moment, you know, they might well regard what's happened in this election as a symptom or a sideshow, because they will say that 2020 was the year when it looked as if Asia had begun to come back past the West, and reversing a process which you could argue has gone on for 500 years. And reasons are very simple. You've had COVID, where Britain and America are up around, I've just looked, over 700 deaths for every million people. All these countries in Asia, many of them democracies, around sort of 30, 40, 50 deaths, so 20 times better than us. And places like South Korea are, you know, sprawling democracies, and they've come up with better systems of government. You cannot imagine an election in, say, Singapore being as chaotic and as badly run as this one. And I think people could look back at this year and say, well, this was the time when the West, especially the United States, lost the leadership. And historians might come and actually say that the leadership was greatest in the 1960s, because back then, America was dreaming of putting a man on the moon, whilst millions of Chinese, going back to what Megan and Leslie were saying earlier, millions of Chinese back then were dying of starvation. Now, in lots of ways I deplore, they will be looking at this and thinking something, you know, this has been a year when they have pulled up and come ahead. So I think people should be worried about this. But the point about the West problems is that they are all eminently fixable. It's not difficult to run a competent election. Most democracies do it. And it's just a matter of taking the public sector seriously, taking government seriously, and getting on with it. But that, you know, unless we do that, yes, that will be the way that they will add a somewhat embarrassing American election to COVID and all the other things that have gone wrong this year. And the other crucial point to say is, even if Biden wins, you know, you cannot put down most of the problems of this election to Donald Trump. He didn't invent a healthcare system that is designed to look after the rich and the old rather than the poor. He's not responsible for racist policing. That's been going on for 30 years. I covered Rodney King. He's not responsible for many of the things that have gone wrong with America. So you shouldn't expect Biden, if he wins, to be able to fix them. So I think the West does need, and the United States in particular, does need a much more systemic rethink. But thank you again to that wonderfully timed question from my point of view.
Thanks very much, John. Look, I'm going to pull it, just a last comment or question to you and Megan to pick up on his point. I'll finish up with Leslie. Megan, there was a very interesting question from Mary Deshevsky. How much does the margin of victory affect the strength or weakness of the US president? Or is it more about the composition of Congress and how the president actually performs? Do you have a sense on that, and any last closing comment?
So I think the electoral system means that we're dealing in margins necessarily. The margin of victory, though, I don't think matters at the end of the day. Other than that, it reflects a divided society. I think it's much more about the composition of government. So whether the Democrats can win the White House and the Senate, or just the White House, that I think the future for US policy is affected massively by that, much more than the margin by which a president might have won.
Thanks very much for that. And Leslie, I'm going to give you the last shot, but there was two, I thought, interesting questions which you might take. One from John Mason: has Biden and Trump's positioning on foreign policy held and made any impact on this election? Is it a cleavage between the candidates' support bases, or is really foreign policy just irrelevant to where we are today?
Yeah, this is where I think polls are wholly inadequate, with all due respect to pollsters, you know, because when an American thinks about the economy, when they go and they tick off the box, right? If you're a farmer and you're thinking about the economy, you're thinking about soybeans and you're thinking about China, okay? If you are, thinking about, I don't know, jobs, sometimes if you're young and you're thinking about jobs, you're thinking about renewables and you're thinking about climate. So there are any number of issues, trade issues, global economy issues, public health. If your big concern is the pandemic, you have the pandemic and you have the vaccine in your mind, and absolutely at some level you're aware that Oxford has this trial and you wouldn't mind getting access to whatever happens internationally. So these are really, really arbitrary measures. Surveys are wholly inadequate. They don't tell you what you need to know. So I think
they just stick foreign policy out of some big, label. As we're definitely got to finish in a second. A last really easy question for you, Leslie. You can finish with this one. Thomas Hodson, the best estimate when we will know who has won. What's your best estimate when we'll know who's won?
Well, not until Britain's lockdown. I think there's something there going on. I think it's going to be, I think we will know by close of business on Friday. I don't know, but I think we'll know I really don't know. Close of business on Friday.
There you go. We won't hold you entirely to it, but you have said it publicly and live streamed. So thank you very much, John Micklethwait, Megan Greene, Leslie Vinjamuri. Just great to have you with us on this crazy day. I know you've got a lot going on and you're jumping from this call to another one. And great to have had so many people join us for this. What was the lovely title we gave this? Early something or others. In any case, yes, early reflections. So we've been reflecting away while we're all scrambling at the same time. But I think to our early reflectors, big thanks from everyone on this call. See you again soon. Thanks for joining us, and keep in touch with Chatham House's work. Lots of good stuff going on in the US and America. So sign up to it if you're not doing it already. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye. Thanks, John.